to our second speaker, Ronald Blankenborg from Radboud Universiteit in Nijmegen, who will speak to us about deictic phonation in textualization. Ronald Blankenborg is an expert on Homeric prosody, but has worked a lot, studied a lot, other literary genres. And so we'll see what he has to say about Greek particles, a very hot subject nowadays. We'll see what he can tell us about that. Maybe a new aspect, maybe not. We'll see about it.
Yeah. And of course, I hope that I can also move forward and backward here, but I'm not seeing the buttons yet, but oh yeah, it will be all right. Let's start then. Today, I aim to demonstrate the deictic phonetic usage of selected ancient Greek particles, whereby particles primarily represent sounds functioning as symbols, a phenomenon known from other languages and not exclusive for ancient Greek. As oral symbols, particles structure narrative, but they do not represent semantics per se, but they merely strengthen the text's explicit message and or implicit meaning. Particles' main focus, this is going to work, is prosodic. As little words with fixed orthography, particles features as parts or syllables of lexical words without being lexicals themselves, much like pre- and suffixes. Their status as affix is mirrored by their realization as clitic, unable to feature as independent prosodically demarcated phonation or as independently phonated lexemes. Particles resemble phonemes like syllables and morphemes like affixes. Rather than adding meaning, as do most combinations of syllables, or delineating syntactical functions, as do many suffixes, particles are rather indicative of larger scale structure, meaning, and intent, much like the deictic affixes that strengthen tense, like the augment, or aspect, like reduplication in present tense, in perfect tense, and in pluperfect tense. In all instances, their role and contribution to prosody is more important than their exact shape or contribution to meaning. Particles are oral signals, markers of progression, retardation, and pause through their effect on intonation patterns and boundaries. As such, particles are deictic in their contribution to and effect on phonation, rather than vehicles for meaning. What they do contribute to meaning may better be analyzed as the framing or the staging of the constituents they phonologically and phonetically adhere to. In ancient Greek, particles play a role that goes well beyond an effect on the phonation of intonational patterning. As clitic phonemes, they appear in orthography and syllabification. As affixes, think of egog and little words, to an extent that exceeds the occurrence of comparable phenomena in written languages generally. This heightened visualization of deictic phonation is a remarkable instance of the interplay between oral and written tradition. It elicits the question, why particles? My computer is not doing what I want it to do. Just a minute so that I can get back to text. Sorry. Having some technical problems here. Yeah. This heightened visualization of deictic phonation is a remarkable instance of the interplay between oral and written tradition. It elicits the question why particles were materially preserved as written symbols too. I will briefly discuss the semantics and the shape of particles before starting to argue that and trying to demonstrate how the clitic character and the unstable thesis of particles both serve as indicators for what may be labeled intonational deixis. To that end, I will analyze the way in which shape and prosodic characteristics enable the particles to function as the demarcation of intonational phrases and rhythmical unities in various metrical surface structures. As rhythm brings out the constituent phrases in the metrical surface structure, particles are applied to signal and to emphasize the phonological demarcation. Flexible and adaptable particles are suited to fill out meter and rhythm more than lexical words are. My analysis is both a deviation from and an addition to existing particle studies that mostly focus on the syntax and semantics of particles. Particles' mutability and docility to rhythm, I argue, evidences that their prosodic qualities and usefulness outbalance syntactical function and semantic value. Particles' ubiquity in written Greek points at the status of ancient Greek texts as performable and performance. The study of Greek particles benefited greatly, of course, from the work of, oh, I'm gonna at the wrong page, sorry. This is not really working the way I want it to work. Technical difficulties abound. The study of Greek particles greatly benefited from Deniston's Greek Particles, 1934. Among the many virtues of the project is Deniston's attempt to define what particles are. His treatment of particle focuses on two distinct features of the object of investigation, but it is clouded by the non-exclusiveness of the features he attributes to his inherited list of particles. First, particles are indeclinable little words, but of course, so are combiners, prepositions, and adverbs. Secondly, particles as a word class have much in common with word classes like combiners and adverbs. They are in most cases naturally translated by adverbs and have a function as establishing a relationship between separate ideas. Whereas Deniston chose to investigate the matter no further, I argue that what separates particles from the other word classes is mainly a syntactical matter, and it is identifiable by default. Unlike combiners, particles cannot start subordinate clauses, and unlike adverbs, particles do not add their own specific and identifiable meaning. They work non-propositionally, to the word group or to the sentence. Many particle studies appeared since Deniston's The Greek Particles, but the attempt to define particles as a separate non-lexical category of words kept on going without any definite outcome. In the recent particle overview study by Bonifaci at ALI, the term particle is still infelicitous choice of words. In their introduction, so use is nonetheless defined as the authors, and here the quotation starts, have decided to retain the word particle instead of choosing some other term for the following reasons. And next, of course, they explain. First, particle is neutral with respect to the notions conjunction and adverbs. We want to explore, they state, the relationship between connective and adverbial functions of particles in a pragmatic perspective, instead of regarding their syntactical role as either conjunctions or adverbs as their raison d'être. Second, particle does not require a priori distinctions between words that have a propositional meaning and those that are only used non-propositionally. On the one hand, the same lexical term can be used both prepositionally and non-propositionally, depending on genre or context. On the other hand, words have come to have a non-propositional value over time. Third, on a meta-scientific level, it makes sense to retain a term that has survived centuries of scholarship, even if problems and unresolved questions continue to exist. Rather than working on a closed group of lexical items, we focus on particles in terms of a core and a periphery. The core consists of the list inherited from earlier scholarship, of which we have selected those that are most frequent in our corpus. The periphery potentially includes all other words or phrases that work non-propositionally in our corpus. By extension, discussions of other adverbials, connectors, and phrases used as meta-language are mostly subsidiary, and our analyses primarily concern the core particles such as de and te. A different approach comes from Devine and Stevens, who define particles as non-propositional words with specific prosodic qualities. Particles are clitic susceptible to phonetic reduction and without a stable thesis in prosody. At first, this outlook on particles may look like the usual word class confusion. There is still no clear distinction between word classes, though pronouns, prepositions, articles, and conjunctions are invariably excluded based on their propositional working, despite their clitic character. In my view, however, the approach of Devine and Stevens brings out the most important characteristics in order to classify indeclinable words as particles. Since the differentiation between word classes does not provide a useful clue in terminology from antiquity, what we refer to as particles belong to the class of syndesmoi, function words. Particles are to be identified as such based on their prosodic properties. Regardless of the observation that certain prosodic properties are shared by other word classes, susceptibility to phonetic reduction and the unstable thesis do not only define particles, they actually mark the transition of words from various word classes into particles. Hence my argument to identify little words as particles primarily on the basis of prosodic considerations. Particles do not necessarily differ from words in other word classes with regard to their shape and orthography. On the contrary, since they are indeclinable like prepositions and adverbs, or of identical shapes as pronouns and modifiers. What turns such words into existing and identifiable lexical word classes into particles is their transformation over time, a transformation on the level of phonetics rather than phonology. As Bonifazi puts it, words can come to have a non-propositional value over time. Devine and Stevens have shown that this having a non-propositional value over time is induced and indicated by prosodic signaling, whereas non-lexical words are severely restricted in their placement in both the word group and in the sentence. Particles regularly undergo phonetic reduction resulting in elision, permanent crassus, and quantitative shortening. Usage of little words as particles is the direct result of phonetic reduction, itself the effect of intonational variance. Furthermore, particles do not claim a stable thesis, an observation that is convincingly made in metrical texts with regard to non-monosyllabic particles. Particles are prosodically identifiable, or rather, identifiable prosodically. In ancient Greek, status as particle is easiest evidenced in metrical text, poetry and rhythmical prose. Particles are appositive and clitic, either pro or enclitic, and in that capacity markers of discourse, especially because of aural characteristics, since particles contribute to demarcation in the intonation pattern. At the same time, as mentioned above, particles add to the intensity of the lexical word they form a phonetic word with. Particles literally extend the lexical into a phonetic word, thus enlarging the constituents of the clause and the sentence. In every respect, particles are tools for phonation rather than representatives of a specific word class. With regard to semantics, much attention has been given to particles' auxiliary or nuancing semantic function, sometimes to the effect that the particle was awarded its own independent semantics. This approach, I argue, only suits written composition and more often than not defies the attempt to identify independent semantics. From the prosodic point of view, the point of view of oral composition and performance, such semantic value is not to be expected and seems untenable, as rhythmical and intonational clauses resist any adverbial meaning. For certain nuancing and discourse particles, however, not even auxiliary semantics can be readily established. Particles like de, men, gar, ge, de, and o, for example, serve pragmatic purposes as signals, on a par and possibly in combination with gestures. They remain, however, the printed representations of phonemes, of sound. Reduced phonemes, perhaps, appositive and or accentual clitic, but visible. Mentioned particles do not have independent or auxiliary semantics, and their value in spoken discourse is their sound in combination with their effect on intonational patterning. As syntactically pre- and post-positive and prosodically pro- or enclitic, these particles are phonetically realized in the initial syllable in a rising intonational trajectory, or the closing syllable in a falling trajectory, the slope. Phonetically, as a phonetic word initial syllable-shaped sound, the particle O functions as attention-drawing phonation in order to focus the audience on the commencement of semantically valuable utterances to follow. Word-concluding syllable-shaped sounds, de, men, gar, ge, de, un, te, ar, provide right-hand intonational demarcation for the extended phonetic word without contributing to word-level semantics. It is in itself remarkable that ancient Greek has retained the intonational phonation in writing, though on a smaller scale, phonation for pragmatic purposes only is known from other languages, also in their written representation. In English, for example, utterance initial well indicates that speaker demands or reclaims attention, whereas phonation continuing but meaningless indicates speaker's resilience to remain the audience's focus of attention, even despite a temporary lack of semantics. In writing the different instances, No. In writing the different instances of deictic phonation merely indicating the drawing of or continuing claim on audience's attention may or may not be presented. If they are, written attention particles primarily serve prosodic ends. The various degrees of representation in writing are commonly tied to varying levels of orality. The denser the written text with phonation particles, the closer the text's resemblance to unplanned, non-stylized speech. As it is widely observed and attested that unplanned speech displays ubiquitous use of attention-focused particle-like phonation, texts that abound with particles seem to resemble or represent written-out transcripts of orally delivered or deliverable speech. It is tempting to assume that the abundance of particles in certain Greek authors, particularly authors of prose, serves a function in facilitating the reading out loud of the written text in performance. In ancient Greek, the prosodic contour of particles reflects their intonational deictic usage by showing how particles flexibly fill out and demarcate the rhythmical unities in the metrical surface structure and emphasizing particles' significance for elocution rather than propositional content. I will illustrate that their importance and role is primarily prosodic. Particles' clitic character is not...
We have a few more minutes left.
Thank you. Particles' clitic character is not a characteristic of particles exclusively. Words from other word classes may be clitic as well. Given the time, I will move on to some of the examples. Here I will present one. Prosodic boundaries separating spurts in oral performance may be orthographically realized in various ways, either as a space or as a space with complementary printed punctuation, suggestive of pause, preparatory emphasis, or silence. In all instances, however, the printed space reflects phonetic word end and hence intonational closure. Prosodic bridges prevent or subdue intonational closure at metrical boundaries. Particles equally support the timely start and completion of phonetic words within the rhythmical spurts of poetry. And I use my time to present a few examples. The first example now on your screen from epic poetry, in which I have indicated the various positions where particles demarcate rhythmical spurts with some annotation. And in addition, and I realize, of course, that it does take some time to read all this. In addition, an example from tragedy, again, with some commenting notes on the demarcating value and function of particles for the demarcation of rhythmical spurts. And one final example that I particularly like, executed on the newly found Brothers song in the newest subfo. Again, here, some of the particles are clearly used to demarcate rhythmical spurts in the metrical surface structure. To conclude, following on these examples, and I will leave this one on the screen. Together with other means of prosodic start and completion, like the start or completion of a phonetic word with a lexical accentuated word, particles audibly demarcate, but without adding to or enhancing the phonetic word's semantics. Thus, particles are prosodically demarcating and attentionally sensitive, rather than semantically nuancing. In recent research, examples abound of seemingly superfluous or random particles, in particularly the first extant instances of ancient Greek poetry. Think of the use of gar in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And of ancient Greek prose. Think of the use of gar in the histories. In their attempt to reflect rather than visualize the conventions and practicalities of oral presentation and oral reception, both text types fill out and demarcate their constituents by means of, among other non-lexicals, phonation particles. Thank you very much.
Blankenborg, we have to thank you and finish. We have time for one or two questions. Okay, then I'll just try to protest against dubbing particles. What was it? The slope or some deepening or something, the intonational slope of the phonetic word as main office of the particle. I mean, it is true that the particles you quote don't have tenable etymologies. But we all know that particles are soon-semantic, and being soon-semantic, we are not looking for their own semantics and trying to work with discourse and connections and so on and so forth. And this has been done vastly for Greek, of course, as you mentioned. And for Latin, if we stay within the classics. And I mean, of course, they have a phonetic value, but this is not the main function. So maybe these things should be pushed aside a little. And besides, there are other phonic things like the cola of Fedor Frankl and so on, which also have a part in all of this. Could you tell us something about that? I mean, about the highlighting of the phonetic side of particles.
Yeah, what I found very interesting was an example that has been presented a few years ago in an article, I think from 2010, by Leadoff on the Skopos song, and he compared the metrical surface structure of the Skopos song to the possibility to identify in Simonides some glyconic rhythmical unities, not here and there, but as a sequence. So searching for rhythmical unities within a metrical frame that does not suggest this specific rhythmical unity, the identification of demarcating particles with as their primary function, demarcation of the rhythmical unity, glyconic in this instance, I believe was rather convincing. And I think it is a line of argument that we might continue to work with in different genres as well. The demarcating value of particles is, of course, also clearly seen in, for example, and I cited a few on the slides, is clearly visible in the small tags used by Plato to separate his question and answers sequences, and especially Kees Thijs in a very recent publication last month. He showed with some interesting instances the demarcating use of especially man and der in Plato as a means to audibly, so also usable in performance, demarcating what are in essence rhythmical unities, both in prose or rhythmic prose and in poetry. So that's where I think we find the clearest evidence for the primarily prosodic function and value of especially enclitic particles.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.